Hey, welcome back everyone to the Progressive Brothers podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Renaissance Man.
Welcome back, everyone. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, like the video, and peace to everyone in the chat.
Also, make sure you follow us on Twitter at brothers_podcast. This is episode 76. So, the infrastructure bill is at gridlock right now on the Hill, and it could be 6 days, it could be 6 weeks, it could be 6 months, according to Joe Biden, on how to navigate this and figure this out. What's your take on this, Renaissance?
Kind of a little bit surprised, but then when I think about it, kind of not at the same time. It's an interesting situation. Obviously, you have a deal on the traditional infrastructure bill. The big holdup is on the what they call human infrastructure, so investment in things like I believe expanding child tax credit, discounts for daycare, things along those lines. Free community colleges, those things, really human capital. And the big holdup is the progressives have really pushed for, hey, they're not going to have a vote on the traditional infrastructure bill until they have a guaranteed deal in place on the human infrastructure bill, just because that's how you play your leverage right now. Obviously, going into last Thursday, Friday, actually, was it Friday? I think it was, last Friday. There's obviously a vote scheduled for that evening. Nancy Pelosi has obviously said that she will not bring a vote to the floor, that she doesn't have the votes, which it appears she followed through on that. And this vote did not come on Friday. Part of the thing that was the big push was the debt ceiling was tied to this as well, which they got an agreement on that earlier in the week. So that sort of made this last Friday deadline a little bit kind of self-imposed and really not important at that point, even though people like Kirsten Sinema had threatened, I believe on Thursday, not to vote on any reconciliation funding if they didn't have a deal by Thursday. But I think obviously she's backed away from that threat. I think progressives are at least appearing to hold their ground. They said labor had been on the phone all day as far as, really trying to get them to not cave. Really, I think the holdup right now is they got to figure out what Sinema and Manchin want. The progressives obviously want about $3.5 trillion. I think I heard like maybe late or mid last week that Joe Manchin was more at like maybe like 1.9 or something like that. So at least he's put a number out there now, but that seems to be the holdup, is kind of this infighting between Dems, ironically, when versus, traditionally it's been Dems versus Republicans.
I think if you come down below $2.5 trillion, I think that's DOA. And here's why: because it started off at $6 trillion, and then Biden and White House actually helped get it down to, or I should say Schumer helped get it down to $3.5 trillion. If you go below that, if you go below $2.5 trillion, it's dead in the water, because this isn't $2.5 trillion up front, right? This is, $3.5 trillion up front. It's $3.5 trillion over 10 years. So you're talking $300 billion over per year, right? They spend more money on, let's say, law enforcement from a local policing perspective, and if you want to include like FBI, DHS and things like that, they spend way more on that than what they do on infrastructure. So when you really think about infrastructure, Joe Manchin would need it the most, because in his state, they don't have all of the amenities that, let's say, Atlanta may have, or let's say, any of your northern states like New York City or any of these major metropolitan hubs. They don't have that level of infrastructure down there. We've seen the videos. I'm not saying that West Virginia is a third world country, but it's pretty much a developing state. It's not nowhere near where any of the blue states are in the north. And so I find it interesting that he's the holdout for this at the willingness, like you said earlier, at 1.9 trillion. I'm saying your state needs it more than anything. if you don't get this through, your state doesn't change from where it was 10 years ago. I mean, you have coal miners who who have upper respiratory issues. Then you compact that with COVID and a lack of healthcare infrastructure to begin with. That's a recipe for disaster, and that's why I'm thinking if you go below $2.5 trillion, I think that's DOA. I don't see what you can do with less than that.
Yeah. I think, I don't think you go behind 2.5 is what I've heard is where, there'd be a land, which I've heard some progressives say that'd be a win. But like you said, this is over 10 years. It's not like all this money's coming up front. So, I mean, that's debatable whether that's something really to jump up and down. I mean, obviously a win is a win, but still, like I said, this is over 10 years. I think Manchin is obviously, I think, getting kind of bowing to corporate pressures a little bit, as well as cinema, and that's why they're sort of in the way of this. But you're right, his state needs it very much so. I think Dems have done a poor job at messaging that, this isn't $3.5 trillion up front. This is over 10 years. You look at how much Trump tax cuts, how much, he spent and how quickly that was passed pretty much, unanimously by the Republican Party. I just think people really have got to put pressure on progressives to, stand their ground, which they appear to be doing so far. But they've got to get a win, because I was talking to someone else about this. Essentially Biden promised progressives that, hey, if you want to get things, you need people who can basically work with the other side, get compromised. And, Biden's been in the Senate for however many years, 30 something years or something like that. So he knows how to basically get a deal done and basically make Washington work, which was kind of his selling point for being Obama's running mate in 08 and 2012 as well, too, was that, once again, someone who's been in the Beltway knows how the system works. That's really where, this essentially Biden's agenda and basically Dem's words kind of, coming down to it of, hey, we can run a moderate, he can find compromise and you can get things. If this falls apart, then it's eggs on the establishment's face as far as really trying to push a progressive like Bernie or Elizabeth Warren out of the way in favor of quote unquote electability and a more moderate candidate that they believe is more electable and can get things done in Washington. So I think just like there's a lot of pressure on the progressives, I think there's a lot of pressure on the establishment as well.
Yeah, because it's an election season coming up next year, and so if certain people don't get this through, then that can really tip the scales at the polls. And so somebody's going to have to break on something. What exactly do Kirsten and Joe want? I don't know. They're not really clear as to what it is that they want in regards to the bill itself. I mean, dwindling it down, I can understand Kirsten Sinema. She doesn't really benefit from the bill anyways, because Arizona is pretty well developed. But when it comes to Joe Manchin, I mean, he needs it most. But there's a lot of other, I guess what you would call moderate Democrats that are kind of hide behind him. Like, let them take the arrows, but at the same time, we don't really like the bill either. I think somebody has to break on something. I mean, can't we just come to a resolution that COVID proved that we lack the healthcare infrastructure necessary to deal with outbreaks and pandemics? That's a given. Why don't we figure out how to take bills and break them down into fractions and say, this is what we need right here. This is what's necessary from a healthcare standpoint. All of these maskless and non-vaccinated people coming into the ER, we need bigger ERs and we need better clinics. We need a bill that focuses on building up that level of infrastructure and more ambulances and more EMTs and more nurses and more doctors. Why can't we put the money behind that rather than argue over whether or not bridges and roads and things of that nature need to be built? I mean, we have bridges and roads, but if you're not even willing to fill a pothole, I don't think you need an infrastructure bill for that. I think you need better management at the ground level. But when it comes to the real infrastructure, such as healthcare, that's where most of these states, like Joe Manchin comes from, are lacking. I can't see how this is even a debate for somebody like him.
Yeah, the other thing I think is kind of frustrating, as I was thinking about this the other day, is to me, Dems kind of played themselves a little bit in the fact that, you got an extra reconciliation. And somehow instead of, they broke this bill up into two. And basically they broke it up under the guise of bipartisan support, which they got on the first infrastructure bill, at least they claim. They, the official vote, hasn't happened. But, in theory, I don't know what you could go look at, which would fall under the rules of reconciliation. But I have a hard time. I sort of feel like Dems sort of backed themselves into a corner on this in the sense of, or just negotiated with themselves for no reason, in the sense of, when you look at the infrastructure, I don't see Republicans, if they had two reconciliations, splitting something like this into two different bills. Mitch McConnell would say, oh, this is one bill like they originally proposed, and then I got to use my other reconciliation on something else, versus, Dems under the guise of bipartisanship, like Biden claims, basically took the infrastructure bill, broke it up into just so they could, get Republican help when they really didn't need it. And it kind of wasted a lot of time, truth be told, negotiating, getting to just an agreement on the first infrastructure bill.
Right. You would think that they would add, stimulus relief bills and in that as well. I just find it interesting that we talk about spending $6 trillion between Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, but then when it comes to an infrastructure bill, we're like, no, let's dwindle it down to at least 1.9. And I'm like,
what happened to America First?
What happened?
What happened to America First?
Yeah. Yeah, right? And so this is like a gift to the Republicans. The conservatives are looking at this, licking their chops, saying, hey, look at the left fight it out. And I'm saying, at least we're fighting over something. You guys are fighting over nothing over there, because you got nothing out of it. Trump spent $6 trillion during COVID, propping up failed businesses like American Airlines and Delta and some of these other, tier 1 Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies, and no one seems to have a question about that. But when it comes to this infrastructure bill, they're like, well, I think there's a lot of social benefits in there that we're not really comfortable with. And I'm saying, have you looked at the numbers for COVID? Have you looked at the numbers for these opioid addiction cases and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? The basic healthcare infrastructure is lacking. It just doesn't make any sense to me that they would want to argue from that position and not understand that, at least for me, I don't want to, if I'm representing West Virginia, who heavily supports Republicans for whatever reason, who do nothing for them, and the state looks completely opposite from the rest of the states up north, I can't see myself going back home to my home state and saying, I did a great job in Washington. Not necessarily, because I haven't brought anything back. And that's where I would be very concerned if I was somebody like Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema, on the campaign trail for next year, because you can be in some deep doo-doo going forward.
Yeah, and that's the other thing for Dems. Dems got to win this battle, because Dems always they got to run on something. They can't just run on Trump, where the Republicans are crazy. They got to run on something they did, and this is one of the
Republicans are crazy though.
Yeah, no, you're right, but that's what Dems get criticized for, is that you're not going to be able to turn out your base and get people to continue to vote on, hey, look at how bad Republicans are. You got to do something.
Yeah, infrastructure bill is going to be really necessary. I mean, Biden talked about putting up hundreds of EV charging stations all across the country, and these big networks, and 5G, and high-speed internet to all of these low-income areas. You're not going to do that with $1.9 trillion. I'm sorry. That's just not going to happen. Over 10 years, this is not going to happen.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, Manchin was originally on record for $3 trillion when this first got introduced, so got cut way back.
$6 trillion at the beginning of this.
Yeah. Just for the traditional infrastructure alone, it was $3 trillion. He sort of decided, and it got cut down by a third. So,
yeah, I don't know how you make this move other than if we don't do this, then nothing else is going to get done. I just don't see. If we don't pass this, then the military doesn't get anything. Law enforcement doesn't get anything either. That's the way how I would play the game if I was in that position. We're not signing up for anything else until this gets done. Okay, you want to take out electric vehicle charging stations? Okay, fine. Well, I'm okay with that, right? I'm okay with taking out, ferries. And I think we covered this in the past, like in a few months ago, on a previous podcast. All these things about ferries and things being, added in there. I'm on record for saying that that's crazy to be adding that type of stuff in there. It didn't make any sense. But that's why it was so big to begin with. But if you take these sort of, fillers out, then it makes a lot of sense of how you can actually come to a compromise. But that thing is 2,500 pages. Who's going to read that? And who has read it?
Nah, that's the other thing. Yeah, no, it hasn't been read. A lot of people have said that a lot of private stuff has gotten in there, that a lot of big business interests. So you may start seeing toll roads and everything pop up. Yeah, sure. There's a lot of corporate lobby interest in the infrastructure. The first one,
right? And I just think this is really making the left look bad in terms of Biden's build back better. You build back better, build back nothing. I mean, that's really what it's coming down to, because nothing is moving at this point. And even if it does pass in the next 6 weeks or the next 6 months, like Biden says, this is not going to take effect until at least 2022, 2023. So that time frame, like nothing is really moving right now at this point. And we're still in the, at least in the fog of a pandemic where people are still kind of questionable as to what's going on in terms of the infrastructure. I mean, you're sending kids back to school, but you don't even have enough PPE, for the kids at school. And then you have parents coming up to the schools fighting over whether or not their kids should be PPE and CRT and everything else. Like, we had a whole year to get public infrastructure up to snuff in terms of returning people back to work, in sending kids back to school, and we haven't done anything. We haven't done anything. I mean, they're opening up windows, at least back in August. They were opening up windows because they didn't, the suggestion by, I don't know if it's the WHO or the CDC, says that, you should have windows open, you should have plenty of air circulation, right? That's because most of your inner city schools don't have HVAC systems put in place. And so that's the lack of infrastructure that is necessary to actually operate, K through 12. But if you're telling me that, you're going to dwindle it down to 1.9 or less than 2.5 or 2.5 at best, I'm sorry, but those public schools, they're going to lose out big time. They're never going to get the infrastructure components that they need to actually operate, from a COVID-free sort of environment.
No, I agree 100%. It's that's the dangerous part of compromise. It seems that basically the big things always get cut down in the name of saving money.
Absolutely. Like, share, and subscribe. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at brothers_podcast.